Welcome to Liberated Life. Stress and Anxiety Management. The purpose of this video is to educate people on the effects of stress and anxiety on the brain and body. Later in the video, I will be giving you some simple ideas and solutions that will help you to become more resilient. A recent national stress survey has found that almost 3/4 of UK adults, that's 74%, have at some point over the past year felt so stressed that they became overwhelmed or unable to cope. So what is stress? And why is it affecting so many of us on a daily basis? Stress is a response that occurs in our body when we believe that we cannot cope with our external circumstances. What you may not know is that not all stress is bad for us. Having some stress can motivate us to get out of bed, hit deadlines, or focus on an important piece of work. But when our stress levels rise and we become overwhelmed, it can have a very serious impact on our physical and mental health. The difference between stress and anxiety. The terms stress and anxiety are often used by people to describe the same experience. This is because they both have very similar symptoms. However, there is a difference between the two conditions. Stress is your body's reaction to a trigger, usually in the form of an external situation, and is generally a short-term experience. This is because the symptoms stop once the situation has been resolved. Anxiety, on the other hand, is an ongoing problem. It is caused by excessive, fearful thoughts and can produce significant problems because it starts to impact our social, occupational, and personal lives. It can help to think of it like this. Stress is a reaction to what is happening in our current circumstances. Anxiety is a reaction to our thoughts about what might happen in the future. So what is happening in our bodies when we get stressed or anxious, and what can we do about it? Let's have a look at the brain. This is the bit that you know as you, the prefrontal cortex. It is the conscious part of our brain, the part that interacts with people and the world around us. It is attached to a vast intellectual resource, the intellectual mind, which helps us to learn and function in our daily lives. This part we don't share with other animals, which is why they can't drive cars or operate computers. Now, when we operate from this front part of our brain, we generally get things right in life. It will always come up with answers based on a proper assessment of the situation, because it is logical, rational, and it is generally very positive. But there is another part of the brain. This is the original primitive part, and the center and most influential part of this brain is called the amygdala. This is generally referred to as the fight-flight area of the brain, and it is associated with two other very primitive parts. The hippocampus, which creates our new memories, helps us regulate our emotions, and holds all of our primitive behavioral patterns and experiences. And the hypothalamus, which regulates the chemical responses in the body and mind. So, in summary, the amygdala signals the danger, the hippocampus decides how to handle it, and the hypothalamus starts the chemical response to get the body ready to take action. The body is regulated by our autonomic nervous system. This consists of two twin nervous systems that work together, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is activated during the stress response and gets us ready to deal with the threat. It quickens our heart rate, opens our airways, tenses our muscles, and suppresses our digestive, reproductive, and immune system so that we can focus all of our energy on survival. The parasympathetic nervous system is used to help us rest and recover once the threat has passed. It slows our heart rate and breath, relaxes our muscles, and reactivates the other systems. So let us imagine that when you leave here today, you ran into a polar bear. What would happen? Well, your anxiety would go up, and you would lose intellectual control, and you would move from this part of the brain, the intellectual brain, to this part of the brain, the primitive emotional brain. Your sympathetic nervous system would be activated. You would go sweaty, your heart rate would increase, your stomach would churn, and you'd be off like a shot. In these circumstances, this response would be entirely appropriate. But unfortunately, the same response can happen in our daily lives. When our anxiety goes up, and this can be a gradual process, we lose intellectual control. And to a greater or lesser extent, the primitive mind takes over. And this mind will always operate within the primitive parameters of depression, anxiety, and anger, or a combination of all three. If our primitive mind thinks for one reason or another our life is in some kind of crisis or emergency, it will step in to try and help. Depression, anxiety, and anger are all primitive opt-out clauses that help us to deal with perceived threatening situations. But where do these responses come from? When the caveman looked out of his cave and there was snow, ice, or danger, and he couldn't go out to hunt, he pulled the rug over his head and he wouldn't interact until the situation had changed. We have adapted this to all the modern-day symptoms of depression. If we were in the jungle in those days, we wouldn't have been too far away from our panic button at any given time because there were so many dangers around. And anger was simply a primitive way of increasing our strength to defend ourselves against wild animals and other wild tribesmen. So our ancestors were often faced with situations where they would have to fight, run, or hide, which is where the expression fight, flight, or freeze comes from. These responses have helped our species survive and thrive where other animals became extinct. The only problem is the primitive part of our brain hasn't evolved, and it still thinks and reacts as if we're still in the jungle. But there's more. The primitive mind is a negative mind, and it will always see things from the worst possible perspective. And if you think about it, it has to, for your own self-preservation. If you did run into a polar bear, it won't be saying, "It's probably eaten." No, quite rightly, it will say, "This bear is going to try and eat you." This response is great when we run into polar bears, but not so good when we have an exam or an important presentation to do. It is also an obsessional mind. If you did have a polar bear in your garden, you would be reminded of it constantly, and you would keep checking, which is good when you're trying to survive, but not great when you're trying to get some sleep and you're worrying about the exam the next day. It is a vigilant mind. If the perception is that there's danger all around, then it's wise to stay on red alert. But if there's no danger in the office or the classroom, but you can't relax or concentrate because you're feeling anxious, then this isn't very helpful. Stress can also significantly affect our IQ, which means we make poor decisions when we feel overwhelmed. And because the primitive brain is not an intellect, it cannot be innovative or creative. It has to refer to the previous patterns of behavior stored in our hippocampus. So, if what we did in the past ensured our survival or simply made us feel better, then we're encouraged to do it again. For example, avoiding situations or resorting to other coping mechanisms like smoking or drinking alcohol. So how do we create this anxiety, which causes us to move from the intellectual, sensible part of our brain to the angry, anxious, depressed part? Anxiety is caused by negative thinking. It is not the events in our lives that necessarily cause the perception of crisis. Because if that was the case, then everyone at university or in crowded offices would be suffering from anxiety or panic attacks. And we know that that's just not the case. So it must be our thought patterns surrounding the situation that are causing the problem. Every negative thought that we have is converted into anxiety. We can create this anxiety by negatively forecasting the future, big things like not having enough money to live on, or it can be small things like that class or meeting that we have to go to. Here, we should remember that our mind cannot tell the difference between imagination and reality, and it reacts in the same way to you imagining something as it does to it actually happening. Intellectually, we know that the meeting is going to go okay. They generally do. But we start thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And we might think about it 50 times. The actual meeting or class goes quite well, but we've attended 51 versions, and 50 have been disasters. We can also think back to past events which had a negative outcome, and this will create anxiety in the same way. Think about it like this. Imagine that there is a small child in your brain watching a large screen. Every time that you think about these negative scenarios in your mind, you are playing a movie to that child who has virtual reality goggles on. It thinks that these things are really happening. So it's no wonder that you often hear a voice in your head telling you that the world is a scary place or that you're not good enough. Now, every negative thought that we have is accumulated and stored in a mental stress bucket. Thankfully, we have a natural method for emptying our bucket, and it's known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement, dreaming. At night, we rerun the events of the day and change them from an emotional memory to a narrative memory, a memory that we have full control over. Let's imagine that someone upsets you in the afternoon, and it really bothers you. You go home and you tell the people you live with, and they tell you to just forget about it. But you can't. And you're thinking about it when you go to bed. During your REM sleep, you will rerun the event either in a clear or a metaphorical dream, and you will move it from the primitive brain to the intellectual brain, where you have full control over it. So when you wake up in the morning, you may have forgotten about it. You may not. But you will certainly be saying something like, I don't know why I let these people upset me so much. But when a person is under a lot of pressure and having constant negative thoughts about a situation, they are piling too much into their bucket, and eventually it will start to overflow. Unfortunately, REM sleep is restricted to about 20% of our sleep patterns. If we try and overdo that, the mind wakes us up. And you'll know that it's your mind waking you up because you'll be wide awake and probably feeling quite miserable because you can't get back to sleep again. It's important to note that REM takes a great deal of energy, and when your bucket is full, your brain has to work even harder during REM sleep in an attempt to diffuse the anxiety that's been piling up. So even if you've managed to stay asleep, you can wake up feeling exhausted, which adds to the problem because you're now feeling depressed in addition to the anxiety, and you're encouraged to sleep more and more to empty the bucket. Now you are in the grip of a bit of a vicious circle. The more you have in your bucket, the more time you will spend in your primitive brain, which means you will be encouraged to be negative and your sleep will continue to be affected. So how do we break this cycle and get you back on top of things? Well, we certainly need to restrict the amount that we're piling into our stress buckets. But there's one more important piece of the puzzle that we need to learn about before we talk about the solutions. And that is what happens chemically in the brain and body when we suffer from stress, anxiety disorders, and depression. To answer this question, we need to revisit our ancestors. early man and early woman experienced quite definite internal chemical rewards for carrying out certain evolutionary processes. They got rewarded when they hunted and gathered and successfully supported themselves and their families. This is because we were more likely to survive in a tribe rather than individuals, so they got rewarded when they interacted positively with others. Scientists are adamant that they would have recognized these rewards and felt motivated. But even more importantly, these rewards were a coping mechanism. It helped them cope with their daily activities, helped them cope better with fear, it made them braver, and it even helped them cope with physical pain. Thanks to modern science, we now know what these rewards are. It's a chemical response in the brain that produces various neurotransmitters and hormones that encourage us to keep doing these mentally healthy behaviors. And the neurotransmitter we talk about most, simply because it's the most important, is serotonin. When we produce a constant flow of serotonin, we are nice, happy, coping, brave people. So we need to operate within these positive parameters like early man. And although we don't need to go out to hunt, we do need to interact in a positive way, be active in a positive way, and think in a positive way. Because when we do, we produce patterns in the brain that give us a constant flow of serotonin. So what stops the flow of serotonin? Well, when you're down the miserable, depressed end, we don't produce any chemicals at all. When we're up at the anxious end, we produce an overload of stress hormones, like adrenaline and cortisol. These are great in short bursts when we run into polar bears, but not so good for running our daily lives. Long-term exposure to stress hormones can have a very damaging effect on the body. So we need to get you back in this part of the diagram. So how do we reduce stress and become more resilient? The first thing is to not beat yourself up about it. Now that you understand how the body and brain work, you know that feeling negative and all of the other symptoms is normal when you're under pressure or in survival mode. Your aim is to get back into the prefrontal cortex of the brain, where you'll be in a better frame of mind to deal with the problem. For more information or support from one of our specialist therapists, please visit our website www.liberated-life.com. Thanks for listening.